Every morning in Canada, millions of people do the exact same thing. They stumble into the kitchen, reach for their Folgers or Tim Hortons coffee, press a button on the coffee machine, pour that first cup, and hope it wakes them up enough to deal with the day. But here's the uncomfortable question almost nobody asks. What is actually in that cup? Because when you start looking into the coffee industry in Canada, some strange things pop up. Brands that look Canadian but aren't. Coffee pods that release microplastics when brewed. Cheap beans mixed into premium blends. And a few companies quietly controlling huge chunks of what Canadians drink every single morning. Now, before anyone panics, coffee itself isn't the villain here. In fact, good coffee can be fantastic. But the brands behind it, that's where things get interesting. So today we're looking at 7 coffee brands Canadians may want to rethink buying, and 2 Canadian roasters actually doing things the right way. Some of these names are probably sitting in your cupboard right now. Let's start with something the coffee industry rarely talks about. Coffee is one of the most chemically complex drinks people consume every day. When coffee beans are roasted, hundreds of compounds form through what's called the Maillard reaction. That's what gives coffee its flavor. But roasting also creates something else, a compound called acrylamide. It forms naturally when foods are heated at high temperatures. Bread has it, potatoes have it, and yes, coffee has it too. Health Canada has been monitoring acrylamide levels in coffee since 2009, along with international food safety agencies. The key takeaway isn't that coffee is dangerous, it's that processing methods matter. Low-quality beans roasted extremely aggressively tend to produce higher levels. Instant coffee and very dark industrial roasting can sometimes test higher than fresher whole bean products. And then there's another issue that gets talked about more in specialty coffee circles: mold contamination. Coffee beans travel thousands of kilometers before reaching Canada. If drying and storage conditions aren't controlled properly during transport, mold can develop. Now, reputable companies test for this, but many large commercial brands don't publicly disclose testing results at all. So with that context in mind, let's start looking at the brands. Let's start with one of the most recognizable coffee cans in North America, Folgers. That red plastic tub has been sitting on Canadian grocery shelves for decades. The marketing makes it feel nostalgic, almost like part of the family kitchen. But Folgers today isn't really about coffee craftsmanship. It's owned by the J.M. Smucker Company, a massive American food conglomerate better known for peanut butter and packaged foods. Coffee is just one product category inside a very large portfolio. And Folgers' business model is pretty straightforward. Produce coffee cheaply and at massive scale. Many blends combine Arabica and Robusta beans. Arabica is the smoother, higher quality bean grown at higher altitude. Robusta is cheaper, more bitter, and used frequently in instant coffee and low-cost blends. There's nothing inherently wrong with Robusta, but when companies blend it heavily into coffee sold as everyday premium products, that's usually about keeping costs down. Another issue is freshness. Almost all Folgers products sold in Canada are pre-ground coffee. Once coffee is ground, it starts losing aroma and flavor within weeks. By the time many of those tubs reach store shelves, the coffee has already been sitting in warehouses and shipping containers for months. You're paying for the brand name, not necessarily the best beans. Next up is another household staple, Maxwell House. The slogan used to be "good to the last drop," and for decades, Canadians believed it. But the modern Maxwell House operation is very different from the historic brand. Today, it's owned by Kraft Heinz, one of the largest packaged food companies in the world. And their coffee strategy looks very similar to Folgers. Large-scale production, blended beans, heavy use of Robusta to keep prices low. One interesting detail about the Canadian coffee market: a relatively small number of companies control an enormous portion of what appears to be dozens of competing brands. So when you see multiple coffee tins fighting for shelf space, sometimes the profits are actually flowing to the same parent company. Maxwell House remains one of the cheapest coffees available. But with coffee, cheap usually means compromises somewhere along the way. Now let's talk about instant coffee, specifically Nescafé. Instant coffee is extremely popular because it's convenient. Just add hot water and you're done. But the process used to create it is pretty intense. Coffee is brewed into liquid on an industrial scale. Then that liquid is either spray dried or freeze dried into powder or crystals. Spray drying in particular involves extremely high heat. That heat can degrade flavor compounds and create a noticeably different taste compared to freshly brewed coffee. And then there's the ownership side. Nescafé is owned by Nestlé, the largest food company on the planet. They operate in more than 180 countries. That scale makes coffee incredibly profitable for them. But it also means their coffee supply chain prioritizes volume and consistency over craft roasting. Instant coffee isn't inherently unsafe, but if you enjoy the flavor of coffee, most coffee professionals will tell you the same thing. Fresh beans almost always taste better. Here's where things start getting interesting for Canadians. Nabob coffee. The brand has a long history in Canada. It started in Vancouver in the late 1800s and built a reputation as a proudly Canadian product. But today, Nabob is owned by Kraft Heinz, the same parent company behind Maxwell House. So when you see Nabob on one shelf and Maxwell House on another, it might feel like you're choosing between two different companies. But financially, you're often buying from the same corporate owner either way. To be fair, Nabob does tend to use 100% Arabica beans, which is generally a step up from cheaper blends. But the ownership story is a reminder of something many Canadians don't realize. Branding can stay Canadian long after ownership changes. Now we need to talk about coffee pods, because pods have become one of the fastest growing segments in the Canadian coffee market. One major brand is Van Houtte, which started in Montreal in 1919. For years, it was a well-known Quebec coffee company, but the brand eventually became part of Keurig Dr. Pepper, a massive American beverage corporation. And the bigger issue isn't just ownership, it's the brewing system. Single-serve pods work by forcing very hot water through plastic capsules at high pressure. Recent studies have found up to 43 microplastic particles per liter in hot coffee brewed through plastic pods. Microplastics are tiny plastic fragments measured in microns. Scientists are still studying their long-term health impact, but they've been detected in water, seafood, and increasingly, food packaging. Add to that the environmental impact. Billions of coffee pods end up in landfills every year because many are difficult to recycle. Convenient? Yes, but not necessarily the cleanest system. Next is a brand most people associate with premium coffee, Starbucks. Walk into almost any grocery store in Canada and you'll see bags of Starbucks coffee next to the big commercial brands. But here's something many people don't realize. The grocery store coffee is not the same experience as buying coffee at a Starbucks cafe. Most of the products sold in grocery stores are pre-ground coffee. Again, that freshness issue comes into play. By the time the bag reaches your kitchen, the beans were roasted and ground weeks or months earlier. Starbucks also has a very recognizable roasting style, extremely dark roasts. That bold taste is intentional. But darker roasting can also mask lower quality beans because the roast flavor dominates everything. So when you're paying premium grocery prices for Starbucks coffee, you may not be getting the freshness you expect. And finally, we arrive at the most emotionally complicated brand on this list, Tim Hortons. For decades, Tim Hortons was seen as a Canadian institution. Founded in 1964 by hockey player Tim Horton, coffee and donuts on every corner. But in 2014, Tim Hortons merged with Burger King to create a new parent company called Restaurant Brands International. The corporate headquarters is now in Toronto and Miami. Interestingly, all Tim Hortons original blend coffee is still roasted in Ancaster, Ontario, maintaining some Canadian manufacturing. And since that acquisition, many longtime customers say the coffee tastes different. Whether that's roasting changes, supplier changes, or nostalgia talking is still debated. But what matters for this list is the grocery store products. Tim Hortons branded coffee sold in stores is largely mass-produced and pre-ground. and the single-serve pod versions carry the same plastic concerns as other pod systems. The brand still feels deeply Canadian, but the corporate structure behind it is global. When you zoom out, something interesting appears. A surprisingly small number of multinational companies control a huge portion of the coffee Canadians drink. Kraft Heinz, Nestlé, Keurig Dr. Pepper, Restaurant Brands International. That doesn't automatically make their coffee bad, but it does explain why grocery store shelves often look competitive while the profits funnel back to a handful of corporate owners. Meanwhile, smaller specialty roasters have to fight for visibility. Which brings us to the good news. There are still Canadian coffee companies doing things very differently. One of the most respected Canadian coffee brands today is Kicking Horse Coffee. It started in Invermere, British Columbia in the Rocky Mountains. Unlike many large commercial brands, Kicking Horse focuses heavily on certified organic, 100% Arabica beans processed using the Swiss water process for their decaffeination. Organic certification means farms must avoid synthetic pesticides and fertilizers and follow strict agricultural standards. They also emphasize fair trade sourcing, which aims to ensure farmers receive fair compensation for their crops. And most importantly, the company sells a lot of whole bean coffee. Whole beans stay fresh significantly longer than ground coffee. Grinding them right before brewing preserves more aroma and flavor. That's why many coffee enthusiasts recommend buying whole beans whenever possible. Another standout Canadian roaster is 49th Parallel Coffee Roasters based in Vancouver. They've built a strong reputation in specialty coffee circles and represent what third-wave coffee culture looks like in Canada. One thing that sets them apart is their focus on direct trade relationships with single-origin coffee farms. Instead of buying coffee anonymously through large commodity brokers, they often work directly with specific farms. That allows them to know exactly where beans were grown and how they were processed. It also typically means farmers receive better compensation for higher quality harvests. Most of their products are whole bean coffees designed for grinding fresh at home, which brings the experience closer to what you get from a high-quality cafe. So what's the takeaway from all of this? Coffee itself isn't the problem. Millions of Canadians drink it every day, and many studies link moderate coffee consumption with health benefits. The real issue is how the coffee is produced. Mass market brands often prioritize scale, consistency, and cost. Smaller specialty roasters tend to focus on sourcing, roasting quality, and freshness. Neither approach is inherently evil, but they produce very different cups of coffee. And once you understand what's happening behind the label, it becomes a lot easier to choose what ends up in your mug every morning. Now I'm curious, what coffee do you actually drink at home? Tim Hortons, Kicking Horse, something completely different? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy these Canadian food investigations, make sure to subscribe, because there are a lot more we still need to uncover.